The boathouse burned for 7 minutes before the roof collapsed. Inside the metal bucket on the floor, the last page of Julian Vane's true will, the one that would have saved the family, dissolved into ash, while Arthur, the only man who knew its contents, clawed his way through smoke and flame toward a high window he could barely reach. 3 months earlier, none of this was supposed to happen. Arthur Penhaligon sat at his mahogany desk with hands that would not stop shaking. The Sony mirrorless camera on the tripod was positioned with care, its lens aimed directly at the leather chair where he now sat. Around him, the home office existed in a cathedral of books, floor-to-ceiling shelves containing 15 years of the family's secrets, filed and cross-referenced and locked behind his own moral compromises. The desk lamp cast a pool of warm light over the scattered paperwork. Arthur's cardigan, navy with pearl buttons, hung loose on his frame. At 65, he had learned that life didn't always reward honesty, but silence had a currency of its own. The currency was kept in a hollowed-out copy of Contract Law 1994 on the third shelf. He reached for it now, his fingers trembling as they found the spine. The book opened like a clamshell, and from inside he withdrew a silver iPad with a cracked screen. The device was old, the battery perpetually dying. But what it contained was worth more than his life, or less than his life, depending on how the next 12 hours unfolded. Arthur entered the passcode, A914. The date Julian Vane had been buried. The patriarch's funeral had been 3 years ago, and in the years since, Arthur had discovered that the man he'd served for 4 decades had been murdered by his own son. The iPad's home screen appeared. A single folder labeled CHRONICLE sat waiting. When Arthur opened it, thumbnails of video files populated the screen. A digital archive of 17 hours of footage documenting theft, coercion, and premeditated killing. In one thumbnail, a younger man, Elias, the family's favorite son, stood in a hotel room holding a briefcase. His eyes were wide, his hair was disheveled. In another, Elias sat in a hospital cafeteria with a handwritten note in his palm. The text was small but legible in the zoomed-in frame. Digoxin in Julian's IV, done by 6 p.m. Arthur stared at that image for a long time. He reached for the glass of scotch on his desk. The amber liquid caught the light as he drank half of it in a single swallow. The alcohol burned his throat, which was appropriate. Everything about the past 5 years had burned in one way or another. The red light on the camera blinked to life as Arthur pressed record. "My name is Arthur Penhaligon," he said, his voice raw and barely above a whisper. "For 15 years, I have been a lie." The camera's red light reflected in the dust motes floating through the lamplight. Behind Arthur, the book stood silent, testimony to everything he'd witnessed and never reported. "Before I tell you what happened," Arthur continued, "you need to understand how it started. 5 years ago, in the rain. 5 years prior, the parking garage had smelled like concrete and gasoline and the metallic perfume of approaching winter. Arthur had been younger then, or at least his joints had protested less. He'd driven his silver Volvo to the underground level where family members met when they had things to discuss away from the main house. Elias was already waiting, leaning against his black Porsche with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been told no. He held a cigarette between his teeth and wore a suit that cost more than Arthur's monthly salary. The two had a complicated relationship. The family's in-house lawyer and the patriarch's favored son had never quite aligned their interests. "The offshore audit for your sister's medical fund is short $3 million, Elias," Arthur had said, holding out a yellow manila folder. His voice had been steady then. His hands had been steady. Elias had smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Audit?" he'd said, dropping the cigarette and crushing it beneath his loafer. I thought we were family, Artie. Family doesn't audit family. Family doesn't steal from family either, Arthur had replied. What happened next occurred in the space of 4 seconds. Elias had crossed the distance between them like a pouncing cat. His hand had closed around Arthur's throat, a grip that turned the world into a tunnel of dimming light. Arthur's head had connected with the Volvo's window, and the impact had created a spiderweb of cracks in the glass. Arthur couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was survive. His right hand, the one not clawing at Elias's wrist, had found the silver pen in his jacket pocket. It was a Mont Blanc, a gift from Martha 20 years ago. Arthur had jammed it into Elias's thigh, driving it deep between the muscle and the bone. Elias had screamed, a sound that echoed through the garage like something inhuman. He'd released Arthur and stumbled backward, pulling the pen from his leg and dropping it on the concrete. Arthur had scrambled into his car. The engine had turned over on the second try. As he'd reversed rapidly toward the exit, he'd seen Elias in the rearview mirror, standing upright now, his hand pressed against his bleeding thigh. His other hand was raised like a gun, fingers splayed. A threat, a promise. The yellow folder had been left behind, soaking in an oily puddle. Arthur had never asked about the money again. Now, in his office, recording his confession, Arthur took another drink of scotch and looked directly at the camera. That was when I should have walked away, he said. That was when I should have done my job. Instead, I did what I'd been trained to do. I stayed silent. 3 weeks ago, a month before the recording, Arthur had been called to the Evergreen estate on a matter that had nothing to do with the family's finances or legal standings. He'd been called because Martha's estate needed to be sorted. Martha, his late wife. Martha, who had died 6 years ago of a heart condition that shouldn't have taken someone so strong, so determined, so genuinely good. The attic had been undisturbed since her death. This was intentional. Arthur had never been able to bring himself to go through her belongings. Now necessity compelled him. He'd knelt among the moth-eaten blankets, his knees cracking with age, and pulled out the blue trunk that Martha had kept for her knitting supplies. He'd removed the needles, the yarn, the half-finished sweater that would never be completed. And beneath all of it, he'd found the leather-bound journal with Martha's initials embossed in gold. MP. His hands had shaken as he'd opened it. The journal was a record of financial transactions. Each entry was dated and annotated in Martha's precise cursive handwriting. Most of the entries were mundane. Money transferred to her mother's care facility, donations made to the orphanage, utilities paid. But in the last 10 pages, the entries changed character. They became furtive. They were amounts paid to Martha, always in cash, always marked with initials and cryptic notations. The last page contained a list, and next to an amount of $50,000, Martha had written, "Paid by Elias for A's silence." Arthur's hand had trembled so badly that he dropped the journal. It had fallen to the attic floor with a sound like a gunshot. Below that entry, just visible, was another. Used for Arthur's heart medication, the digoxin trial, paid in cash. He doesn't know. He never will. God forgive me. An envelope had been tucked into the back cover of the journal. Inside was a pharmacy receipt dated October 12, 2019. The medication listed was a state-of-the-art cardiac compound that cost $12,000 per month. And it had been paid for by his wife, with money from Elias, in exchange for Arthur's willingness to overlook a theft that had happened 5 years earlier in a parking garage lit by sodium bulbs. Arthur had understood, in that moment, that his wife had been dying, and she had made a choice. She had taken Elias's blood money to save her husband's life. And then she had taken the secret to her grave. A shadow had fallen across the attic door. Arthur had snapped off his flashlight. The journal had been hastily shoved inside his cardigan as footsteps had approached from the hallway. His heart had hammered against his ribs in that ancient, primal rhythm of a predator sensing danger. The footsteps had stopped outside the door. Then they'd moved away. Arthur had waited in the dark for 20 minutes before descending the stairs. The back stairwell of the Evergreen estate twisted downward through 3 stories, narrow and wooden and older than memory. Arthur had been halfway down when the upper door had opened. Marcus stood in the doorway. He was a wall of a man, 6'4" and 240 pounds of security consultant hired by the family to protect their interests. He wore a black tactical vest that made him look like a piece of military hardware. His face was blank in the way that professional violence makers often were, all effect removed, leaving only function. "Elias wants the book, Arthur," Marcus had said. His voice was the color of concrete. "Give it over." Arthur had tried to push past him. What followed was a dance of desperation and survival. Marcus had grabbed Arthur's shoulder and swung him toward the railing. Arthur's hip had connected with the wood hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Then Marcus had reached for the journal, his meaty hands grasping at Arthur's cardigan. Arthur had fumbled in his pocket and found the brass paperweight he'd snatched from the attic. It was heavier than it looked, solid and cold and reassuring in his palm. He'd swung it with every ounce of strength left in his aging body, and it had connected with the side of Marcus's head with a wet final sound. Marcus's eyes had rolled back. Blood had trickled from his hairline. He'd staggered, and Arthur, channeling some reserve of fury he didn't know he still possessed, had kicked him in the shin and shoved him backward. Marcus had lost his balance. He'd tumbled down the half-flight of stairs, his body making a series of heavy thuds against the wooden steps until he'd come to rest at the landing, sprawled and unconscious. Arthur had run. He'd burst through the kitchen door into the cold night rain, the journal pressed against his chest, and he'd kept running until he'd reached his Volvo in the driveway. Only when he was safely inside the car had he allowed himself to breathe. That had been 3 days ago. In the privacy of his home office, Arthur described all of this into the camera, his voice growing stronger as the confession continued. The scotch was empty. The sun had set completely outside the windows. Darkness pressed against the glass like something with weight and intention. "I became complicit," Arthur said, looking directly into the lens. "I saw Elias steal from the family charitable trust. I saw him drain accounts meant for his sister's medical care. And I said nothing. I was paid in silence, and the price was my own integrity." He told the camera about the hospital room. 3 years ago, when Julian had been dying, the patriarch had looked skeletal in the hospital bed, hooked to machines that breathed for him and monitored his failing heart. Arthur had visited in the evening, when the halls were quiet and the visiting hours were ending. He'd stood by the bed and watched the man who'd employed him for 4 decades breathe in and out in measured, mechanical rhythm. Julian's hand had found Arthur's sleeve. It had been so light, so weightless, that Arthur had almost not felt the touch. The old man had pulled Arthur closer, and with lips barely moving, he'd spoken words that had taken 15 years for Arthur to understand. "The will in the safe. It's a fake. Elias made me sign under threat." Arthur had pulled back, shocked. And in that moment, his eyes had caught something he shouldn't have seen. A camera lens, hidden in the smoke detector on the ceiling. Red light blinking, recording. He checked Julian's medication chart. Elias's handwriting was on the newest entry. Medazocine administered at 4:15 p.m. The date was circled, The notation emphasized. Medazocine was a drug Julian was severely allergic to. The allergy was in his file. It was written in red pen. It was impossible to miss. Arthur had understood, in the hospital room, that Elias was killing his own father. And he'd understood that someone, Elias or one of his associates, was documenting the conversation, the deathbed confession, the proof that Julian had been coerced. When Arthur had heard the lock turning on the hospital room door, he'd quickly returned the chart to the foot of the bed and adopted a neutral posture. A nurse had entered, checked the IV, and left. Julian had died 8 hours later. The funeral had been held on September 14th. The patriarch's will had been read on September 15th. It had left the bulk of his $50 million estate to Elias. Everything else, the secondary properties, the stock holdings, the charitable foundations, had been divided among the other family members. No one had ever questioned the authenticity of the will. Arthur set down his empty glass and pressed stop on the camera. The red recording light died. He sat in the sudden quiet of the office, listening to the hum of the heating system, the distant sound of the city beyond the windows. His phone had begun to ring at 2 a.m. The caller ID read, Elias Vane. Arthur had stared at the ringing phone for a long moment before picking up the receiver. He'd remained silent. Marcus is in the ER with a skull fracture, Arthur, Elias had said, his voice smooth and cold as a blade. You've grown claws. I'm impressed. I truly am. The game is over, Elias, Arthur had replied, his voice steady. I have the ledger. I have the hospital records. I have everything. Elias had laughed. The sound had been metallic, grating, wrong. You have until 8 a.m. tomorrow, Elias had said. The inheritance signing is scheduled for then. If you aren't there with the original will, the real one, not the fake one I've already destroyed, I'll release evidence that you helped Martha embezzle those funds. You'll die in prison, Uncle Artie. I'll make sure of it. The line had gone silent. Elias had hung up. Arthur had looked at his watch. 2 a.m. He had 6 hours until the inheritance was signed, and Elias's claim became legally unassailable. He'd opened the iPad and begun uploading a video file to a public cloud server. The file had been 6 gigabytes. It contained his confession, interspersed with footage from Martha's journal, photographs of the fake will, and copies of hospital records showing Julian's fatal drug allergy and the medication that had been administered despite it. The upload had progressed in increments: 15%, 20%, 35%. At 4 a.m., Arthur had left his house. The boathouse was a half-mile from the main estate, situated on a private lake that the Vane family had owned for 3 generations. The dock was rotten, the floorboard soft with decay. Arthur had walked carefully, carrying a crowbar and a heavy-duty flashlight. Behind him, the main estate was dark. Ahead of him, the boathouse sat like a sleeping animal. Inside, Arthur had known exactly where the real will was hidden. Julian had shown him the hiding place 15 years ago, when the will had been first drawn up. It had been hidden beneath a floorboard marked with a carved X. A precaution, Julian had said. A just-in-case measure, in case anything ever happened to the physical will kept in the family safe. Arthur had jammed the crowbar into the edge of the floorboard and pried upward. The nails had screamed as they'd been pulled from the wood. A metal box had been revealed underneath. Arthur had just begun to lift it from the floor when a shadow had detached from the corner of the boathouse. Elias had stepped into the moonlight, and in his hand was a black 9mm pistol with a suppressor affixed to the barrel. "I knew Dad told you," Elias had hissed. He always loved his honest lawyer more than his son. Everything after that had happened in the language of violence. Elias had lunged, Arthur had swung the crowbar. Elias had dipped beneath the strike and slammed the pistol whipped into Arthur's ribs. Arthur's breath had been driven from his lungs in a gasp of pure agony. Elias had kicked the crowbar into the lake. He'd grabbed the metal box from the floor, he'd pointed the gun at Arthur's forehead, and his finger had tightened on the trigger. "Goodbye, Arthur," Elias had said. "Thanks for finding the real will for me. I'll enjoy burning it." The boathouse door had burst open. Elias and I are splitting the estate 50-50. Clara had taken the metal box from Elias. She'd opened it and pulled out a stack of parchment. The real will, the one that would have distributed the Vane fortune according to Julian's true wishes. She'd held the Zippo to the corner of the document. The old paper had caught fire immediately. Orange flames had consumed the edges of the pages. Clara had held it until the heat became too much. Then she dropped the burning documents into a metal bucket on the floor. "Goodbye, Arthur," Elias had said, and it had sounded like a benediction. The two of them had backed out of the boathouse. Elias had kicked over a can of kerosene stored in the corner. The clear liquid had snaked across the floor toward the bucket of burning paper. Then Elias had tossed Arthur's phone onto the wooden boards, well out of reach, and had closed the door behind him. Arthur had heard the lock engage from the outside. The kerosene had ignited with a sound like the world opening. Flames had roared up and spread across the floor in a spreading pool of light and heat. Black smoke had begun to pour upward, filling the boathouse with toxic darkness. Arthur had pressed himself against the back wall, coughing, eyes watering. His ribs had screamed with every breath. But somewhere in the chaos of heat and smoke and pain, he'd spotted it. Martha's leather-bound journal, which he'd left on the floor in his escape from the house earlier. He'd crawled across the burning floor and grabbed it, pressing it to his chest. His eyes had watered from the smoke, and he'd looked up toward a small, high window. A window, perhaps, 10 feet above the floor. "I won't let it end like this, Martha," he'd said to the journal, to the memory, to the commitment he'd made the moment he'd opened that attic trunk. He'd found the heavy-duty flashlight. Using it as a tool, he'd smashed the glass of the high window. The shards had scattered down like frozen rain. Then he'd spotted a fishing net hanging on the wall, old and weathered and strong. He'd begun to climb. His muscles had burned. His ribs had felt like they were splintering. His coat had caught fire at the hem, and he'd felt the heat begin to consume the fabric. But inch by inch, he'd pulled himself upward, his hands finding purchase in the netted weave, until he'd reached the broken window and had felt the open air beyond it. Arthur had tumbled out of the window onto the wet grass. He'd rolled, extinguishing the flames on his coat. Behind him, the boathouse had become a torch of orange fire, a conflagration of wood and kerosene and desperate secrets. He'd crawled through the bushes, avoiding the main path toward the estate. From a distance, he'd seen Elias and Clara walking calmly back toward the house, apparently confident in their work, confident that they'd left nothing behind but Ash and Arthur's corpse. His Volvo had been parked in a wooded area beyond the guest house. His keys had been in his pocket. He'd fumbled with them, his hands shaking so badly that it had taken 3 tries to unlock the door. He'd collapsed into the driver's seat, his body a landscape of pain and fire and adrenaline. The laptop had been in the back seat. Arthur had powered it on and opened it on the passenger seat, using the car's Wi-Fi hotspot to establish a connection to the internet. He'd navigated to the cloud server and verified that the video file had finished uploading at 4:47 a.m. "Upload 100% complete," the screen had read. Arthur had opened his email and had begun typing rapidly. The recipient field had filled with "Everyone Vane Enterprises com." He'd copied the link to the video file. He'd pasted it into the email. He'd added one line of text. The truth, finally. Then he'd hit send. The confirmation had appeared within seconds. Message sent to 452 recipients. Arthur had leaned back in the driver's seat, and he'd laughed. A dry coughing sound that hurt his ribs but felt necessary. Across the lake, the boathouse had burned itself out. By dawn, there would be nothing left but ash and metal, and the ruins of whatever future Elias and Clara had imagined for themselves. 12 hours earlier, Arthur had started recording in his office. 12 hours later, he was sitting in the main hall of the Evergreen estate. Dressed in clean clothes, his arm in a sling, his face bandaged in patches. Watching as the truth unfolded in real time. Elias sat at the head of the long table, looking perfectly composed. He wore a fresh suit and had carefully groomed every strand of hair. Clara stood behind him, her expression serene. The family notary had begun laying out legal documents. The forged will, the falsified trust documents, the paperwork that would legally transfer $50 million and several properties into Elias's name. 10 other family members sat around the table, looking somber and resigned. This was what family looked like when greed went unquestioned. Acquiescence, silence, acceptance. It's a tragedy about Arthur, Elias had said, his voice modulating into an expression of deep concern. A tragic accident in the boathouse last night. But we must proceed with Father's wishes. He'd leaned forward, reaching for the gold pen the notary had offered. Then every phone in the room had chimed. Dozens of electronic pings had overlapped, creating a chorus of notification sounds. Elias had frozen mid-gesture. Clara had looked up sharply. The notary had paused, his pen mid-air. One of Elias's sisters, Sarah, who worked in the family business and kept her phone always within arm's reach, had pulled hers from her pocket. Her face had gone pale. She'd touched the screen, and the video had begun playing, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Arthur's voice, recorded in his office just hours earlier. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. For 15 years, I have been a lie. The video had shown Martha's journal, the entries documenting bribery and corruption. It had shown hospital records with Julian's documented allergies. It had shown footage Arthur had somehow obtained, footage from cameras hidden in places Elias had thought secure, showing Elias administering the fatal medication to his dying father. And it had shown Elias and Clara in the boathouse, conspiring to burn the will, to destroy evidence, to commit murder. Elias had stood up so quickly that his chair had fallen backward. His composure had shattered like glass. His eyes had darted between Clara and the exit, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. 2 police officers had entered from the side door. Their uniforms were blue. Their hands were resting on their holsters. They'd moved with the purposeful calm of people who'd arrested plenty of murderers. Elias Vane, Clara Dupont, one of them had said. You're under arrest for the murder of Julian Vane, insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and destruction of evidence. Elias had tried to run. Clara had tried to bargain. Neither of them had gotten 10 feet before the officers had restrained them. Arthur had walked into the boardroom from the main entrance, supported by a young officer, his arm in a sling, his face patched with bandages. He had carried Martha's journal in his free hand. He had walked directly to where Elias was being handcuffed, and he had looked the man in the eye. I'm not a lie anymore, Elias, Arthur had said. Elias had tried to spit at him. The officer had prevented it. 1 month later, Arthur sat at his desk in his office. The room was quieter now, cleaner. The clutter had been organized. The photograph of Martha on his desk, the one with the cracked glass, had been reframed with a new one beside it. A photograph of Arthur's son, in his Coast Guard dress uniform, smiling at the camera. A newspaper sat on the desk. The headline read, "Elias Vane and accomplice Clara DuPont sentenced to life in prison for murder and fraud." Beneath the headline were photographs. Elias looked hollow, all the arrogance burned away. Clara looked angry, which was somehow worse. Arthur opened a secret compartment in the desk, hidden behind a false panel only he knew about. From inside, he withdrew a thin, yellowed envelope. Inside was a photograph he'd never shown to anyone. It showed Julian Vane, the patriarch, holding a baby. The baby's face was small and unclear, but the resemblance to Julian, unmistakable to anyone who knew both men well, was evident in the shape of the head, the line of the jaw. On the back of the photo, written in Julian's careful handwriting, "Arthur Jr. Keep him safe, Artie. The true Vane heir." Arthur had only been 27 when Julian had given him this photograph. Arthur's wife Martha had been pregnant. The baby born 3 months later had arrived with complications. The doctors had said he nearly died in the delivery room. But he'd lived. He'd been strong. He'd been raised believing his father was a mere family lawyer, never knowing that his biological grandfather was the patriarch himself, never knowing that his real inheritance had been hidden from him his entire life. Arthur's son had become a sailor. He served in the Coast Guard now, and he had no idea about his biological lineage. Arthur had kept the secret for 4 decades. He had kept Julian's secret. He had protected the child from the knowledge of his true identity because Julian had asked him to, because someone, somewhere in his father's complicated life, had made a choice to trust Arthur with something precious. And then Arthur had broken that trust. He had chosen to speak. He had chosen to record the truth, to send it to everyone in the family enterprise, to expose the corruption and the murder that had been committed in the name of greed. Arthur had finally become the man he was supposed to be. He picked up his fountain pen and opened a new ledger. He wrote a single entry in his precise handwriting. Julian Vane's true heir remains protected. The corruption ends here. The silence ends here. The truth is all that remains. He closed the ledger and switched off the desk lamp. The office fell into shadow. Arthur walked to the door and opened it. The hallway beyond was lit by the evening sun. He stepped through and closed the door behind him. The brass nameplate on the door caught the last light of the day. Arthur Penhaligon, trustee. The brass caught the light one final time. Then darkness came. Arthur walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the tile floor. Behind him, his office was closed and sealed. The secrets of 4 decades remained exactly where they belonged, locked away, protected, and finally at peace.